Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Anthropology 490. It's anthropological theory. It's Wednesday, April 24th. We only have one person in class, so we'll kind of do a little option play today. We'll save David Graeber until Friday, and hopefully some of y'all will show up. Talk about some other kind of living anthropologists who I kind of find really interesting. Hopefully you'll find them interesting as well. And it would kind of, I think, give you some ideas as you think about maybe where you want to go or what you want to do as you kind of graduate and move beyond. These are some of the other people who could inspire you and to go to grad school or to different kinds of research projects, right? And the thing with theory, I think, is that it's often like we get the sense that it's like dead people wrote theory and that like modern people don't write theory. We just like do anthropology, right? We just do ethnography or whatever. And then like theory's already been written. And especially like I've talked to like 3 people this semester, professors who are like, I don't really like theory because after postmodernism, it's all kind of over. And I'm like, well, postmodernism is like, from the 80s, it's like 30 something years ago. Like lots of really smart people have been writing stuff. So like, let's move on. And I think we can kind of see with some of the living people today, these are just not everybody who's still living who's super important. These are people who I like. And when I go to conferences, try to stalk them and go to their talks and see what they're into, kind of like fanboy it up, just like how other people would with actors or movie stars or something like that. So let's take a look at some of these. First, he's James Scott. I like he is born 1936. He's pretty old. I think he's emeritus now, but he's still kicking. He was at Yale for a long time. Looks like William and Mary and University of Wisconsin-Madison. His primary field work is in Southeast Asia and Burma, Malaysia, especially kind of in Southeast Asia during the end of the Vietnam era. The Vietnam War. And so a lot of his stuff, his early stuff kind of has to do with that. One of the books that I really like and is pretty influential is his 1976 Moral Economy of the Peasant Rebellion and Subsistence in Southeast Asia. And it is a cool book. Peasant studies have always kind of been a part of anthropology because we're like always going out to villages where people are like farming. But it gets kind of it's one of those things that comes in and out of fashion in anthropology. Like our peasants, like they're not a culture, right? Because people can be in different places and been doing this peasant thing. It's not particular to one particular place, but it seems to be this way of life. It's like hunting and gathering, or pastoralism or something. And so he kind of like rehabilitates this idea, and he talks about how this peasants are often like actors in this in these larger kind of global forces. And one of his main arguments is that traditionally there's these like moral economies between kind of patrons and clients in peasant society. You can think of like feudal ages, the lord in his castle and his peasants. And why don't the peasants just go kill that guy in the castle? Well, he's also stronger than, richer than, but he also is like supposed to take care of them and look out for them and have big feasts for them and build the church for them and all that stuff. So are these kind of relationships versus like kind of the free for all of modern capitalism, right? And he says that when these kind of moral authorities or these social relationships get kind of replaced with economic relationships, they get kind of it sets the stage for revolution and revolt, things like that. And this was kind of expanded on in his next book, 1985's Weapons of the Weak, which is about kind of peasant resistance and how this can range everywhere from like armed resistance to kind of passive resistance, or just kind of dragging feet when you're working for somebody else, and how this can really act as a counteraction to kind of state level hegemony or colonial hegemony. Right? The thing that I use a lot is the Seeing Like a State. I think this is probably his most famous book. And it's about like modernism and modernity and how governments seek to create legibility, right? This is modern, he argues, is a modern phenomenon, like since the colonial era. The governments, this is something I use a ton of in my own work. that one of the things that like makes you a modern nation state is having control over your territory, right? We have this idea of like really like a map of, if you ever look at a map, I teach geography. So you're gonna look at maps a lot. And one of the interesting is there's very little overlap, right? All the borders like come up to each other exactly. There's very, very few areas in the world today where you have multiple groups claiming the same area. It's mostly sold. And there's almost no no areas in the world where no group claims, right? So there needs to be kind of the borders. And within those borders, the government needs to be the sole authority on legal violence, which is kind of classic theories of the state, but also that the government needs to have legibility. And I talk about this a ton in my dissertation. Making everybody, especially in these like post-colonial, so like British used to have colonies in Africa or in Central America or wherever, right? And now they leave, and these colonies aren't built along like ethnic lines or cultural lines, right? They're oftentimes multiple groups stuck together, or there's a group that's kind of split between two different post-colonial countries. So one of the things that's really important, he says, for these new governments, congratulations, you're a new government. You have, 5 different ethnic groups who are all restless and they want to fight each other, and there's no national idea. There's no sense that people like have any kind of commonality. So one of the things the government's trying to do is to create this kind of top-down state, and one way you do that is through education. You get everybody to go to the same school. You start to keep track of everyone. Because if you can't keep track of everyone, how are you even can control, right? So keeping a census, making people live in permanent settlements. So you see whether it's pastoralists moving around with their animals, or like Maya agriculturalists switching their houses whenever they move their farms. The government doesn't like that, tries to shut that down. Introducing things like last names, like passports or identity cards, like phone numbers, like having a uniform language or uniform religion, right? Why is all that important? Because it creates like a sense of we are America, right? Or we are Belize or wherever. And so a lot of this is like I don't know what the right word is, the datafication of a country, right? That you go from like, this is like this, our country is like this area where our military and our police can operate as the sole legitimate source of violence, to like a country is data, right? Like, so when I worked in Belize, they have a census department. Oh no, it's statistical records. Right, so most countries will have something like this, Statistical Institute, and it's about making things legible, right? So like, how many people are there actually? Like, where do they live? And GIS is a part of this now too. You can do things like, what are the consumer price indexes, for what are the different commodities and how much do they cost at different times? What are the populations? We have this much people living in this community and they're of this ethnic group, right? In Corozal, the biggest town is Corozal town. There's 7,000 people, 3,000 males and 4,000 females, 1,900 households. What's the point of all this? Why are governments so keen on this? Do you think this kind of data collection, whether it's population, whether it's medical data, whether it's ag data, whether it's industrial production type of data? Governments are always super hungry for data. This is something I'm really interested in. Why do you think that is? Yeah, right. Or even if you don't, it gives you an illusion of knowing what's going on, because sometimes these numbers are completely broken, because like when you actually collect them, like someone who's been a census enumerator in the US as well as in Belize, data is always broken. But it gives you the sense of control. And I think that's what Scott argues, that like it gives these new governments a sense of control. And then they like try to do these big projects, right? And because things break down to numbers, right? I'm going to build a big dam because it's going to raise the livelihoods of all these people, but it doesn't really take into account all the destruction it's going to cause, or how those those kind of like ideas, right? This high modernist kind of urban planning. He goes to the book is all about all the failures of it, whether it's building dams that like, you know, people in one of the examples, the Aral Sea. This is in kind of on the border of like Kazakhstan. This used to be in the Soviet Union. It's down here, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, right? It used to be like the fifth largest lake in the world. Basically, in order to make more money during the Soviet Union, they diverted all the water to cotton farms. And between 1960 and like 2009, the lake shrunk like 95%, right? And you get these like crazy pictures of boats like out in the middle of nowhere. Right? There used to be port towns, and now there's campus, right? So it's all about these, whether it's in the U.S. or in the Soviet Union or in Brazil, right? Like, oh, we're gonna like cut down on the forest and make cattle farms or soybean farms because the world market price is really good. And so countries will be like, well, we need to really improve exports because it's going to raise taxes. But then there's often these like side effects because they come from basically treating your country as nothing but numbers to maximize. Like it's almost like a video game. You're trying to turn all the dials to make the most money, but there's all these like externalities, right? Just because you've converted things that are real and complex into just numbers, right? So I really like his stuff. I think it's really cool. He's definitely got a crew of followers, especially in like the development literature. I'm currently working on an article with Dr. Schmidt over in sociology. It's on the Belize Health Information Database. So basically, since 2000, one of the millennial goals in Belize of their development is to create a health database that covers everybody in the country. Belize Health Information System, BHIS. That's not a picture. Show me a picture. Right. So trying to basically they went from in the 80s and 90s to like every hospital, like basically no records at all, to being like, we need to keep records. And this is going to make us more efficient. We're going to like be modern. It is when you read the stuff, like the reason they're keeping it is like, well, we want to be modern. We need to keep better records. And basically we can't get any funding from outside when we look like we're just podunk post-colonial people who can't keep good records. So we're going to create, a database like this of all the people. And every time you go to the doctor in Belize, they're going to use this, like an app now, where you can like the doctor will put in the data and it's going to create this like complete panopticon. All the clinics and polyclinics and hospitals and private doctors in the country are going to be linked together, and it's going to be great. All right, we're going to have this complete. We didn't talk about Foucault and missed his day, but what Foucault called panopticon, like this complete view, 100% perfect view of what's going on in the country. There's a Argentinian author, Borges. It's like a novelist writer, right? And he has a short story called The Map of the World, in which, it's like an allegory. Somebody creates a map of the world and like, it's great, but make it bigger. And they're like, yeah, they made it bigger. And like, make it bigger until they make it the entire size of the whole world that has perfect detail. So you create this map that's like 100%, copy of the real world. And so that's what kind of these databases are doing. Except for it's all broke. None of it works. The data is collected badly. It never you can't use the data to do statistical analysis. It was collected by different people who are using different definitions. Some people are collecting it on, notebook paper. There was questions about what disease is counted for what and how do you, is it heart disease or hypertension? Are you looking at things at the personal level, at the village level? It just didn't work, right? But why has this been going on for 20 years? Why do they keep pushing it? Why do they keep running all these projects? And the idea is that it's part of this modernity project. You have to show that you're doing this in order to get funding, in order to get recognition. You kind of hook into the World Health Organization and these Japanese Social Development Fund and these other big projects because you're doing this kind of data analysis. So it's one of these things that you need to do to be a modern state. So I think it's super interesting. And so the other half of that is this Michael Taussig kind of side of things. Michael Taussig, I really like his stuff. He has great pictures. kind of like an Anthony Bourdain looking, a rock star looking guy. He did his work in South America, kind of like the northern Peru or northern Colombia. Um, he's from Australia. He born in 1940. He got his PhD at Columbia, and he's really interested. He ties into, again, some of these other theories, which we didn't spend too much time on this semester, but especially kind of Marxist anthropology, and then mid-century, what we call like the Frankfurt School. Walter Benjamin is probably the most well-known of those people interested in. We kind of talked about them a little bit with Baudrillard and kind of this idea of focused on what happens when you basically invent the camera and the printer and the movie. Suddenly, things that are real are no longer as interesting or as captivating as these replications. So what happens when the replicant is more interesting than the real, right? So it's kind of like the big theme of Benjamin, and Talisic kind of takes that work further. I really like, I use this book a ton in my dissertation, Devil and Commodity Fetishism. Commodity. Devil and Commodity Fetishism. It's like a classic 80th or 80s kind of anthropology book, but he's still writing. I kind of like some of his new stuff almost as much or more. Picture. Picture. Just the picture. It's a really good book, and it talks about local perceptions of colonialism and globalization, which I think is super interesting, right? So he did his work among people who were peasants in northern Colombia and had like, they were kind of, you've seen the movie Encanto, it's like set there, right? These are people, and like the Encanto movie, people who are like what we think of like traditionally Latino, but also African American mixed in for slaves who were kind of working on these sugar plantations who gained their independence, indigenous people. So it's kind of this very mixed up area. And it has this complex relationship with global capitalism, because these are people who were for a long time like workers on a sugar plantation. Sorry, I realize I'm not even on screen. But then are now peasants, right? So that's the first half of the book. The second half is these guys down here. These are miners down in, I think this is Peru. It's Peru or Bolivia. People who are miners in silver mines down there, and looking at ethnographically how they talk about it. And what's interesting, and he makes the point in this book, is that in both of these cases, the kind of post-plantation peasants, as well as in these miners, who are again a mixture of indigenous and Latino people, they talk about it in these like very metaphorical ways, especially related to the devil. And these, you can see here, this is like in the mines. There's this idea that like capitalism is almost embodied in the devil, which, you know, any of us who are questionable of modern capitalism can kind of see the connection there, especially if you're like a miner. You go down in the mines, right? You have these statues. You kind of pay tribute to the devil because you're like, well, one of these days, you know, it's going to be me down here, and we're taking silver out of the ground, and there's got to be some kind of sacrifice. Blood needs to be spilled. That's why accidents happen in the mine, right? This is an inherently greedy activity. We're like taking from the earth, and a lot of this extractive kind of colonial capitalism is commodified or is personified through these kind of devil figures, in a way that it is like he parallels it to like Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, right? This idea that in modern capitalism, commodities, so the things that we buy and sell, seem to take on a life of their own, right? That when we buy an apple at the store, Apple is like this thing, right, that exists separate from all the people and the land and everything who produced it, right? We create this thing, and the person at the store selling it to you has no real connection to it, and you don't have a connection to it other than when you buy it, right? And so in much the same way that we are kind of mystified by this is like this mystification is kind of personified in these supernatural metaphors. And I use this in Anna Singh's work, Realm of the Diamond Queen, because I think it's really interesting to think about how, whether it's miners in the Andes, silver miners talking about, capitalism and the mines is like the devil and how it's, blood for silver. Or Anna Singh's talking about oil development in Indonesia and how people who are affected there, they're losing their forest, getting their houses taken away, getting their, attacked by the military to drive them out. Think of these as headhunters, right? And so within these local cultures, I think it's really cool to like look at what their stories and myths are about global forces, about capitalism, about the coming of these exploitive colonial structures, and then use that as a way as anthropologists, right? It's not me kind of making up this metaphor. It's like them using that, and then you can kind of unpack them, be like, well, why are they using this, and how does this kind of speak to their position? Right? It's like them at the very bottom, at the very lowest rung. Like if you're a indigenous miner and silver miner in Bolivia, you're at the very lowest rung of global capitalism, right? So this is you speaking up to these webs of power, right? Your counter narratives, I think is what he would call it. I'm really into his new book. I just started reading it, and the thing I really like about modern theorists is that, like, as someone who's, well, who's lights, as someone who's like, I'm kind of a slow reader and I got lots going on. I really like modern people because they can like watch YouTube videos of them. Like, so Michael Taussig will have an interview with him, or I just listened to one of his. He'll give like a keynote lecture for an hour and talk about a book, which is kind of nice. I'd like to hear it from them versus just read it. I really like his. He wrote 87, Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man. This is when he started to go he went a little crazy for a while. He's kind of on the ayahuasca or something. And he was really into this kind of like shamanic stuff, and how indigenous people often have this kind of shaman figure, and this can act as kind of resistance to colonialism through these alternate forms of religious experience or embodiment. The thing I really like is 93's mimesis and alterity, and this is what I'm using in my my current article about development, is that and a lot of times in these kind of colonial situations, you get these mimetic movements going on. Mimesis is like mimicry, is where we get the same word. Aristotle, Plato all write about this, going all the way back. It's like classic, not just anthropology theory, but like classic back to like the Greeks, right? What is mimicry? Is it good or is it bad, right? Like Plato being like, mimicry is bad. It's not as good as the real thing, right? It's shadows on the wall of the cave, right? Aristotle being like, mimicry is great. It's how we get art, right? We take something in real life and we write a book about it, and the historical fiction is better than the history. It's got romance. It's got, these like narrative arcs and things like that, right? So it goes back a long way. Walter Benjamin, like I talked about before, with the invention of like printing presses, TV, radio. Again, this idea of mimesis or mimicry was really important. What does it mean? Is it good? Is it bad? Like, what is the moral nature of mimesis? And Taussig uses this to talk about colonialism and how oftentimes in these colonial situations, you get like mimetic kind of reinterpretations of colonial culture. So one of the kind of classic examples is, what cargo cult is? You know that term? It's like, yeah, it's like a classic anthropology like case study. In the Pacific during World War II, you see in South Pacific or anything like that, GIs like fighting on the islands and air bases, and we're going to take these lands back from the Japanese, right? Basically, you get these societies, these Polynesian, these Melanesian societies that are pretty much isolated. They're colonial, but they're just barely colonial. They're on the far side of the Pacific. And then suddenly, either the Japanese or the US just kind of show up in like 1940 or 1941. And the US will like roll into town, build an airstrip, build a city, bring in like tons and tons, like airdrop food, put these boats in and like unload tanks and water systems and all this kind of stuff, right? And make these like booming metropolises on these like coral atolls. And then after a while, like at the end of the war, they just like packed it all up and they went home. People were like, it's crazy. And so you get these things called cargo cults in the Pacific. This is like a religious movement that sprung up in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, where people would basically, these indigenous societies, it was a new religion that was formed. They basically would clear out land to make like pseudo airstrips, right? And this is like a plane they built out of like bamboo. These are guys like dressed up like US soldiers or something like that. Um, Doing this, right? And then if you go through the action, right? If you dress up like soldiers and you carry these fake guns and you make a fake plane, they even have like very classic like coconut radios. There's like a satellite dish or something like that. That if you go through the motions, you call on your fake radio, you stand around like soldiers, that it's going to bring back all this cargo, right? You're going to bring back, mimetically, you're doing the same thing that these soldiers do. You're calling in, you're building an airstrip, you're calling in reinforcements, and then all this like good stuff will come. Here's people with USA written on their chest. So it's like this mimetic kind of thing, and this happens all over the world. Whether it's like in French West Africa, people kind of dressing up as colonial French officers, and there's like this religious cult around that, or like in Guatemala, there's a kind of a hybrid saint that's the conqueror, the Spanish conquistador of Guatemala, ancient Maya deity, and Judas Iscariot, kind of all mixed up, right? There's these, and people like act out these things, right? And so a lot of his stuff was about, what does this all mean? Is this like, in some cases it seems like hegemony, right? You're just like getting these people to buy into the fact that the U.S. or the French are cooler than you and better stuff, so you want to be like them. But in other cases, it acts as like a form of resistance. You're almost like mocking them. One of the classic examples is the Sepur clothing. Can't spell in French. Congo clothes. I don't know if I can find those. Yeah, there it is. These are people who live in Congo or Zaire who have these really fancy clothes, which are kind of meant to like um, mimic European styles, but in other ways kind of mock European styles. And traditionally, they're kind of made out of like the debris of capitals, like literal trash in some cases. Um, but what do you think? Is this co-opting Western culture? Is this people resisting, making fun of like the West, or is this people like buying into the myth that the West is just better than them, or is it like some kind of remix and hybridization? So a lot of stuff written on that. I kind of think it's probably all of that a little bit. Probably the last more, right? People in globalized world often take these pieces and parts, right? That's kind of what we do these days, right? I'm gonna watch a Japanese anime and I'm gonna listen to Brazilian music and I'm gonna dress, in Italian suits and listen to my Japanese iPod or something like that, right? Or my Sony Walkman. But yeah, I think it's really interesting theoretically to look at how it ties back into this kind of globalization thing. How do colonial or post-colonial people deal with like these global structures when you're at a disadvantage, right? You're not coming into the system at the top, you're kind of coming in at the bottom when you gain independence. And how do you deal with this kind of global media and remake it into something that's like meaningful to you? So I really like his stuff. I think he's a really cool guy. He's a little crazy in a lot of ways. I don't know if he should be a student or anything like that, but he's really interesting and a real smart dude. Let's see, you got time for some more. Another guy I really like is Joel Robbins. We're going to talk about David Graeber on Friday. But Joel Robbins and David Graeber was we talked about Marshall Sahlins. Graeber was Marshall Sahlins' students. Joel Robbins was also Marshall Sahlins, one of his other students. Marshall had a lot of famous students, but these are probably two of the biggest ones. His work I really like. He is a UVA PhD, just like me. So he's like I graduated in 2015. He graduated in '98. So he's like probably two generations. He was born in '61, right? So he's like 20 years almost older than me, 19 years. But still, a lot of the same, because people at UVA just live there and die there eventually. So a lot of the same professors, Roy was one of his professors. He also was, I think Fred was also one of his people, but also a student of Marshall and really into kind of that Pacific thing that Marshall's into. He did his work in Papua New Guinea, where a lot of those UVA people did do their work, and was particularly interested in the anthropology of Christianity. Just like how I think with like when we talk about postmodernism, right? We talk about like we need to start to like look at some of these biases that we have, and how they get translated into our theory or our perspectives about what's normal, right? And we did this with gender with Sally Slocum, right? Like we say anthropology, old-timey anthropology is a study of man, but like really it's a study of men. It's not a study of women because there's all these biases and men are doing the research and so they have these hidden understandings of like what counts as like real culture, real work, out there hunting while staying at home and raising kids and getting tubers and hunting little rats and stuff. It doesn't count as work. It's just like, oh, it's nature, right? We'll look at David Graeber on Friday, and he's going to look at comic books, which I really like. It's kind of pop culture scholar, and how our ideas of state and morality and law and legality and violence are all kind of tied up into this and often go kind of unmentioned. Joel Robbins does the same thing, but with religion. And a lot of what he argues is that a lot of our understanding in the anthropology of religion when we go study in other places or other times, in the past, is based on, if not like the anthropologists themselves being like Christian or Jewish, that they come from these kind of backgrounds. We have this like Judeo-Christian kind of worldview built into it when we go look at other cultures, right? So this makes it hard to deal with cultures that maybe don't have like a personified deity versus like a Judeo-Christian. You're like, oh, there's like a guy up in the sky. That's like the character, right? He has the beard and he like judges us when we die and we go stand before him. And he looks in the book and he's like, but like, how do you deal with cultures that don't necessarily have that, right? Where you have like Pacific Island cultures where mana is like this kind of disparate magical force, and like people have it, chiefs have more of it than some people, mountains have it, volcanoes have it, deities, stars, all kinds of things have it, but you might not have a personified deity. Is that a religion, right? Old-timey, really old-timey people like, no, right? They're just primitive. They're just like animist or whatever. They're not like religion like we have, state level religions like Judaism, like Islam, like Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Shintoism. Like there's 10 that maybe get counted as like, you take Shirley's world religions course, you're going to like do a tour of, different religions. But what about all those other people? And anthropologists tend to study with like traditionally, like a lot of people who, when you go to the Papua New Guinea highlands, people who were formerly 20 years ago headhunters and have very animistic religions, what is religion and how do you separate that off from maybe kinship or from ancestor worship? Is that religion or is that just like kinship? How do you separate it off from environment when nature is personified, like all the animals are spirits too, right? And the jaguars in the jungle, when they go home from being jaguars after a hard day, they take off their jaguar hoods and they sit down for a nice bowl of tortillas, just like you do, and they live in villages just like you, right? So he kind of questions that, like a lot of things about what we think about religion, or it's based on that kind of Judeo-Christian kind of ethic that's built into Western thought, going back to the Enlightenment or before. He also that's pretty cool in and of itself. I think it's a good critique. He talks, the thing I like most about it is he has this book with Marshall. Where is it? I don't think which one it is. Oh, Becoming Sinners. This is a big book. It's based on his dissertation. It's really good. And then he's really interested in missionization, right? The process of colonial missionization. And oftentimes, in classic anthropology, these are people who are like colonial people, right? Like they are colonized by Britain or France or the US. And when you get colonized, the first thing they really do after they like conquer you militarily is send in the missionaries, right? And these are all Christian nations, right? And oftentimes in anthropology, we haven't really thought about that quite enough, is what he says. Like we often are like talking about traditional religions, but and if we do mention like the churches or the missionaries, it's often like off to the side, or it's like this is an invasive force, it's coming into this culture. But this is like what's really there. But he says that in a lot of cultures, this is really important to study. It can be everything from like he talks about these people in Papua New Guinea, how it like became this form of cultural revitalization, right? They got a kind of a church in town, and they really focused their town on this kind of like almost millenarian, apocalyptic kind of theology. I talk about this in Belize, and he talks a lot about defetishization. That a lot of what goes on in this kind of Protestant, especially Protestant missionization, is this idea of defetishization, this idea of getting people, again, modernity, right? You can kind of see the stuff I mentioned, this idea of modernity and how basically in colonialism, the idea is you can conquer people militarily, but you have to create this kind of modern mentality where you're like individuals, you have to create where you are separate from your family, right? Nepotism is bad. You pay taxes, you are legible to the government, you appear on the census, you are listed in the conscription rolls in case they need to call you up for military. You recognize that people are real and that spirits and ghosts and ancestors are all not, and that nature is not spirit filled, but instead is natural resources that you should be exploiting to make money so you can pay taxes and buy cool stuff, right? And I use this a lot to talk about kind of the relationship and how this goes together with religion and capitalism all kind of going together in this kind of colonial system in which you get people who are like, I don't want to like start a giant pineapple plantation because this land is sacred, right? Or I don't want to do a cacao plantation because there are spirits that live in the cacao trees, and if you mess with them, they can kill you. So you have to like be really respectful, and you can't take too much, and you leave salt or rum or cigarettes for them as offerings, and then they'll give you some cacao, right? And how religious conversion oftentimes is not just, oh, now I'm Baptist, or now, I was like a shamanist or animist before, now I'm a Baptist or I'm a Pentecostal or whatever. But it's this whole mentality of like, now I don't believe in those ancestors anymore. So, I'm making my own way in the world. I'm not tied to tradition anymore. Tradition is something we should leave behind. It's in the past. We have to leave it behind in order to be modern. I don't believe that there are spirits out there in nature anymore. I'm going to cut down the forest. I'm going to plant crops and sell them as like disarticulated commodities within a global chain. So I think it's really cool stuff. And I think, before the early 2000s, the anthropology of Christianity was kind of a neglected subfield within the anthropology of religion or cultural anthropology more generally. And it's led to kind of studies of Pentecostalism, charismatic Christianity, both in the US as well as kind of in other places as well. Who else do we want to talk about? We have time for one more, maybe. Yeah, what other stuff in anthropology are you interested in? Or I can kind of like maybe tell you somebody who's still living, or at least. Yeah. But yeah, I encourage you, if do you feel like you maybe, what do you want to do with your anthropology degree, I guess? You want to go on to grad school? You want to? I think that it's a good start to kind of just see what's out there. One of the classic blunders, which I did when I was an undergrad, I was in your position. They're like, I want to go to grad school. And I'm like, great, what do you want to study? What kind of perspective? And it's like, I want to study Maya from like a structural functionalist perspective. And I'm like, no, nobody does that anymore. That's silly. That's old fashioned. That's like 75 years old. You give it to modern times. And so I think that often happens in theory class, like we read Boaz and Margaret Mead and Evans Pritchard and Levi Strauss, and people are like, and that's kind of like where it stops. Like postmodernism is probably the last thing you get in a lot of classes, and people are like, done, right? But kind of understand like what are some of the modern things that people are doing, and then kind of I think the thing to do is kind of figure out where you want to position yourself, right? So like within, you think of anthropology, 4 subfields, right? Called bioanth, yeah. And then, within each subfield, there is like a bunch of subfields, right? So then you kind of have to position yourself within that. Like one of my students is doing kind of biocultural stuff with mental health. Like mental health is biological, but it's also cultural, and how is it different in different places? We have the same biological mind of humans, but you have cultural differences in how you name these diseases, or do you see this as a mental disease or as someone who's spirit possessed or shamanic or something like that, right? Other people have done Nancy Shepherd. You're into like medical, kind of biomedical stuff. Nancy Shepherd Hughes. She's really famous in terms of kind of biological stuff, right? Mental illness in Ireland, commodifying bodies. She has some really interesting stuff on organ trade, like people who in India who would like sell a kidney or something for $20,000, because that's like as much as you would make in a year, but you're like contributed to like human trafficking and organ trade and stuff like that. I think it's really, really cool stuff. Kidney sellers, yeah. Another guy, if you're into like the kind of cultural side of kind of the health, the cultural side of the biocultural stuff, right, is Paul Farmer. He's a great example of an academic who's both kind of intellectual, but also kind of this public engagement. He started Partners for Health, which is like a nonprofit, which does kind of global healthcare kind of stuff. His work is primarily on inequalities, right, and especially on infectious diseases, and how a lot of things that we think of as like it's a disease, right? It's a biological disease, but oftentimes this is related to kind of the social situation in those countries, especially within colonialism, and how different ethnic groups kind of relate to each other. So I think his stuff is really cool if you're interested in that as well. But I really like his kind of nonprofit stuff. Wade Davis, we'll do one more. This is like quick hits. He's a Canadian cultural anthropologist. He's probably like, I don't know. He's a public kind of guy, if you know that means, like in a very Margaret Mead, and we'll talk about David Graeber next time. Kind of people who like to be on TV and like be a public intellectual, right? His work is primarily in Haiti, and he was really this like what's this? He was born in 53, so he's pretty young. So this must have been in the early 80s, late 70s. He had a book, he wrote Passage of Darkness and 86 Serpent and Rainbow, which was like a super popular book. One of those anthropology books that kind of like broke through, not just anthropologists were reading it, but popular culture people were reading it. He's written about voodoo and zombies in Haiti, kind of the ethno-botanical cases of like, we have this tendency to think of zombies as like, oh, it's horror movies, it's superstition, it's silly, right? But he's looking at kind of from an ethnobotanical case. You can actually give these people drugs and keep them in a stupor. And basically, people were, he kind of looks at how, even recently, when he was doing his research, people would be kind of drugged, taken away from their families, have something like zombie encounter, forced to work on plantations, and then some of them would eventually escape and kind of go back. And he uses this as kind of a metaphor for kind of the plantation system within global capitalism. But it's a cool book, and it got picked up by, it got made into a movie by Wes Craven. It was like a horror movie in the 80s. And so that's mostly, like the first 2/3 of it follow the book pretty well, and then it kind of goes completely off the rails in the third act, but that's what you would expect from a good horror movie. Mostly, there's lots of, and I could keep going on. There's lots of famous anthropologists that we could kind of do like little quick one hits with. But the point is that like theory isn't over. There's lots of famous people left out there and new people all the time. And then I think some of this recent stuff is super interesting. in a way that like really builds off of old timey stuff, but is looking at modern problems, whether it's global organ trade or like conversion of indigenous people to Christianity, or like the reemergence of voodoo within the modern world, right? All these are like kind of classic anthropology ideas, like looked at in a global 21st century kind of way. So I think it's super cool. And I think the big message is there's lots of interesting stuff out there. People are doing really cool stuff. Theory isn't over just because postmodernism said so, and that you might contribute something of your own someday. So that's it for today. We'll do David Graeber, and we'll watch something on superposition on Friday. That'll be our last anthropologist of the semester. Remember, we also have your presentations are due on Friday, and then we're gonna present them next week. So before we go, Monday is the last day to turn in any late homework. If you have anything that you still need to turn in Monday by midnight, turn it in, or 11:59. All those links will turn themselves off, and you'll be able to collect those points. So please do that. Okay, thanks so much, Gavin, for showing up today. See you next time.